The Yorkshire moors stretched endlessly beneath a sky that had forgotten the colour of mercy, all bruised purples and angry greys churning above the windswept heather like the restless conscience of a dying man. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, in walls of water that hammered against the small carriage with such ferocity that Lady Elara Ashworth could scarcely hear her own thoughts above the tempest's roar, though perhaps that was a mercy, for her thoughts were as bleak as the landscape that surrounded her. The carriage lurched violently, throwing her against the worn velvet seat, and she clutched her mother's cameo brooch, the only treasure she had not been forced to sell, as if it were a talisman against the chaos of both weather and fate. She was 27 years old, a gentlewoman born to silk and society, now reduced to seeking employment as a companion to an elderly duchess she had never met, in a house she had only heard whispered about in the darkest corners of London drawing-rooms. Ravenmoor Hall, they called it, though the name itself seemed less an address than a warning, spoken by those who spoke it at all with the same hushed reverence one might reserve for cursed ground or unhallowed graves. The carriage shuddered again, and this time Elara heard the coachman's cry above the wind, a sound of genuine distress, followed by a terrible crack that seemed to split the very air asunder. The vehicle tilted dangerously, and she braced herself against the door as they came to a grinding, groaning halt that left her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see nothing but darkness and the ghostly shapes of wind-bent trees, their branches reaching toward the carriage like skeletal fingers seeking purchase on the living. When the coachman wrenched open the door, his face pale beneath his sodden hat, Elara knew before he spoke that their situation had transformed from merely uncomfortable to genuinely dire. The rear axle had splintered beyond repair, he explained, his voice nearly swallowed by the howling gale, and they were at least 5 miles from the nearest village, with night falling fast and the storm showing no signs of abating. But there, he said, pointing through the curtain of rain toward a distant rise, there stood a great house, and though he crossed himself as he gestured toward it, he admitted it was their only hope of shelter. Elara followed his trembling finger and felt her breath catch in her throat as lightning illuminated the horizon, and she beheld Ravenmoor Hall for the first time, a vast Gothic edifice of black stone that seemed to grow from the very moor itself, its towers and turrets clawing at the tormented sky like the petrified fingers of some ancient giant frozen in the act of supplication. Most of the windows were dark, but a few glowed with dim amber light, and as Elara gathered her courage and her sodden skirts and stepped out into the tempest, she could not shake the feeling that those windows watched her approach with something very like hunger. Asterisk, this is madness, asterisk, she thought as she began the long walk toward those forbidding gates, the rain plastering her travelling dress to her skin and her carefully pinned hair coming loose in the wind's violent fingers. But then again, madness had become her constant companion these past 2 years, ever since her father's death had revealed the true extent of his gambling debts, ever since the creditors had descended like carrion birds and stripped away everything she had ever known or loved. What was one more mad choice in a life that had become nothing but desperate gambles? The gates of Ravenmoor loomed before her, wrought iron twisted into patterns of ravens and thorns, and beyond them the house waited in its shroud of rain and shadow, patient as a predator, silent as a tomb. The great doors of Ravenmoor Hall groaned open as if the house itself were reluctant to admit her, and Elara found herself standing in a vast entrance hall that seemed designed to diminish all who entered it, with ceilings that soared into shadow and walls lined with portraits whose eyes followed her sodden figure with expressions of aristocratic disdain. She stood there dripping onto marble floors that had likely cost more than her father's entire estate had fetched at auction, her teeth chattering, her dignity in tatters, while servants materialized from the gloom like specters summoned by some unspoken command, a footman who regarded her with barely concealed suspicion, a housekeeper whose starched black dress and severe expression suggested she had long ago decided to find the world wanting. The carriage, Elara managed through lips numb with cold. There was an accident on the moor, but the housekeeper, who introduced herself as Mrs. Blackwood with the warmth of a winter frost, merely held up one pale hand and dispatched the footman with a series of clipped instructions about the coachman and the horses and the wreckage on the road, all while studying Elara with eyes that seemed to catalogue every threadbare seam of her travelling dress, every evidence of gentility fallen on desperate times. They brought her to stand before a fire in what must have been an antechamber, though it was grander than any room Elara had ever called her own, and there she waited, steam rising from her ruined clothes, wondering if she had escaped the storm, only to find herself caught in something far more treacherous. The Dowager Duchess of Blackwood arrived in a whisper of silk and lavender perfume, and Elara's first thought was that time had treated her with the gentle hand it reserved for those born to privilege. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair elaborately dressed, and eyes the colour of spring violets that held both warmth and warning in equal measure. "So you are the Lady Elara Ashworth," the Dowager said, settling into a chair by the fire and gesturing for Elara to take the one opposite. "The daughter of the late Viscount Ashworth, who wrote such a remarkably honest letter about her circumstances that I found myself quite unable to refuse her application." There was kindness in her voice, but also an assessment, a weighing of character that Elara recognized from a lifetime of navigating society's treacherous waters. "You should know, before we proceed, that this house is not what it once was, and that my nephew, the Duke, is—" She paused, and something flickered across her elegant features, something that might have been grief or fear or love, twisted into shapes that defied easy naming. "Difficult. He keeps to himself entirely, haunts the East Wing like a specter of his former self, and has made it abundantly clear that he wishes no company, no comfort, no connection to the world he once inhabited. You are here as my companion, child, not his, and I must ask that you respect his solitude absolutely, for his sake and for your own." The fire crackled and spat, sending shadows dancing across the Dowager's face, and Elara thought she glimpsed something desperate in those violet eyes, something that spoke of vigils kept and hopes long since surrendered. "They say things about him in the village," the Dowager continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Terrible things that are not entirely untrue and not entirely fair, and I will not pretend that Ravenmoor is a happy house, or that you have not walked into a tragedy still unfolding. But I find myself in need of someone young, someone who still believes that broken things might mend, and your letter suggested you might be such a person." Elara thought of the alternative, the workhouse, the streets, the slow death of a gentlewoman with no prospects and no protector, and she straightened her spine despite her sodden clothes and uncertain future. "I am not afraid of difficulty, Your Grace," she said, and if it was not entirely true, she willed it to become so with every fibre of her being. "And I am grateful for this opportunity, whatever challenges it may hold." The Dowager smiled then, a small and sorrowful thing that transformed her face into a map of old griefs, and somewhere deep within the house, Elara heard what might have been a door slamming shut, or might have been only the wind still howling its fury against Ravenmoor's ancient stones. The days at Ravenmoor settled into a rhythm as predictable as the tide, and yet beneath that surface of routine, Elara sensed currents of unspoken history that pulled at every corner of the great house, like undertow, threatening to drag the unwary beneath dark waters. She rose each morning to grey Yorkshire light filtering through curtains that had not been replaced in years, dressed in the modest gowns she had managed to salvage from her former life, and made her way through corridors that seemed to stretch and shift in the weak morning sun, as if the house itself were a living thing that breathed and dreamed and remembered. The Dowager proved to be pleasant company, sharp of wit, fond of poetry and gossip in equal measure, and possessed of a melancholy that surfaced in unguarded moments, like a fish breaking still water before diving once more into the depths. They took their meals together in a small sitting room rather than the cavernous dining hall, read aloud to one another in the evenings, and walked the grounds when the weather permitted, though the Dowager always steered them away from the East Wing, always found reason to turn back when their path took them too close to certain doors, certain windows, certain shadows that seemed darker than shadows ought to be. It was the servants who first gave voice to the whispers that Elara had felt since her arrival, those fragments of tragedy that floated through Ravenmoor like ash on wind. She caught them in pieces, a scullery maid falling silent when Elara entered the kitchen, a footman making a warding gesture when he thought himself unobserved. Mrs. Blackwood's thin lips pressing even thinner when anyone mentioned the East Wing or its solitary inhabitant. "The fire," she heard one morning, the words drifting up the servants' staircase like smoke, changed him into something else entirely, something that ain't quite natural, and another voice responding, 3 years now, and he's not set foot in the village, not shown his face to a living soul outside these walls, and some say he's more ghost than man by now. Elara knew she should not listen, should not let such gossip take root in her imagination, and yet the mystery of the Duke wound itself around her thoughts like ivy around ancient stone, beautiful and destructive and impossible to ignore. She began to notice things, doors left slightly ajar that were closed when she returned, books in the library that had been moved from their places, and once, on a table in the hallway, a cup of tea gone cold as if someone had set it down and forgotten it, or been startled away before they could drink. It was on a night when the wind howled its perpetual lament against the windows, and sleep proved as elusive as peace, that Elara rose from her bed and wrapped herself in a shawl and ventured into the darkened corridors, telling herself she merely needed to walk, to tire her restless mind, to escape the oppressive weight of her small room with its too soft bed and its shadows that seemed to hold too many questions. The candle in her hand cast a trembling circle of light that barely penetrated the darkness, and she walked without direction, letting her feet carry her where they would, until she turned a corner and saw, at the far end of a long gallery, a figure tall, cloaked in black, moving with a strange, halting gait that spoke of pain or reluctance, or both, disappearing through a doorway that seemed to swallow him whole. Her heart seized in her chest, and she stood frozen, the candle flame dancing wildly as her hand trembled, and in that moment, before the darkness claimed him entirely, she could have sworn he paused, could have sworn she felt his gaze upon her like the touch of winter wind, could have sworn she heard, or perhaps imagined, the softest exhalation of breath that might have been surprise or warning or something else entirely, something that sounded almost like longing. It was perhaps a week after that first nocturnal glimpse that Elara's feet betrayed her, carrying her down a corridor she did not recognize until the quality of the air changed, grew thicker. Somehow, heavier with dust and disuse, and something else she could not name, and she realized with a start that she had wandered into the forbidden territory of the East Wing, that shadowed kingdom the Dowager had warned her away from with such careful, fearful insistence. The hallway stretched before her like the throat of some great beast, lined with doors that stood closed against inquiry, their brass handles tarnished to the color of old blood, and though every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to flee to the safety of known rooms and acceptable boundaries, something stronger than instinct held her rooted to the spot. Curiosity, perhaps, or that stubborn streak her father had always said would be her undoing, or simply the magnetic pull of mystery that had haunted her dreams since that first storm-racked night. She had taken perhaps 3 steps further into that forbidden darkness when she heard it, a voice that seemed to emerge from the shadows themselves, low and rough as gravel scattered across velvet, carrying notes of disuse as though its owner had forgotten how to speak to another living soul. "You have wandered far from your appointed territories, little bird." Elara spun toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild thing seeking escape, but she could see nothing, only gradations of darkness that shifted and breathed with a presence she felt rather than perceived. "I apologize, Your Grace," she managed, and was proud that her voice emerged steady despite the trembling that had seized her limbs. "I lost my way in the corridors, and You lie," the voice interrupted, and now she could detect a direction, could sense him somewhere to her left, where the shadows pooled deepest against the ancient stone. "Or if not lie, then deceive yourself, for no one loses their way to this wing, they seek it, they hunt for it, driven by that peculiar hunger that makes children peer into graves and fools question the darkness." A shape detached itself from the wall, tall and broad-shouldered, still cloaked in night, though he had moved closer, and Elara caught the faintest glint of what might have been an eye, watching her with an intensity that felt almost physical. "Run, little bird," he said, and though the words were soft, they carried the weight of command, of warning, of something that might have been plea dressed in the clothes of threat. "This house devours the curious, and I have no patience for innocent things that insist on flinging themselves into the maw of monsters." Every rational thought demanded that she obey, that she turn and flee, and never again let her footsteps carry her to this haunted corner of Ravenmoor. And yet, she found herself straightening her spine, lifting her chin, meeting the darkness where his gaze must be, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "I am not so easily devoured, Your Grace," she heard herself say, and I have known enough monsters in drawing-rooms and ballrooms to recognize that the most dangerous ones rarely announce themselves. The silence that followed was profound, a living thing that stretched between them like a held breath, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had shifted, carried undertones of something she had not expected, surprise perhaps, or the faintest whisper of interest, quickly suppressed. "Then you are a fool," he said, but he made no move toward her, no gesture of menace, and when he retreated once more into the shadows from which he had emerged, Elara thought she caught, just for an instant, the edge of a face turned away, a profile that suggested ruin, and a hand scarred, she realized, terribly scarred, raised as if to ward her off, or perhaps to reach for something he had long since forbidden himself to want. The encounter came not in darkness, as she had expected all subsequent meetings with the Duke must unfold, but in the honest light of an October afternoon when the clouds had parted in one of those rare Yorkshire miracles that permitted the sun to stream through the great windows of the library and illuminate the dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the amber air. Elara had come seeking a particular volume of Wordsworth that the Dowager had mentioned, and she had believed herself alone in the vast cathedral of books, had been running her fingers along cracked leather spines and breathing in that sacred scent of aged paper and forgotten stories, when she turned a corner between towering shelves and found herself suddenly, shockingly, face to face with him, the Duke of Ravenmoor, caught in a column of treacherous daylight from which he could not retreat in time. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved, and Elara's eyes, unbidden, took in what the shadows had so carefully concealed, the ruin that had been made of what must once have been a striking face, burns that carved rivers of twisted flesh across the left side of his visage, pulling at the corner of his mouth, crawling up toward his temple, where they disappeared into hair that had grown long enough to attempt concealment, and his left eye, once surely as dark and penetrating as its counterpart, now clouded to a milky white that reflected the light without seeing it, a dead moon in the constellation of his devastation. She watched him brace himself, watched the way his shoulders squared and his jaw set, and his good eye hardened into flint, prepared, she understood in that instant, for the gasp, the recoil, the hand raised to cover a horrified mouth, all the reactions that must have greeted him in those early days after the fire, all the proof that he had become something from which decent people must look away. But Elara did none of these things, could do none of these things, because what she felt was not horror but a strange, aching recognition, as if she were seeing not a monster but a man who had been fighting a war with himself for so long that he had forgotten there might be any other way to exist. And so she simply met his gaze, his single, searching, furious gaze, and waited, and did not run. "You stare," he said finally, and his voice was a blade, honed sharp by years of solitude and self-loathing. "So look your fill, Miss Ashworth, and then do me the courtesy of admitting what you see, a grotesque, a creature that should have had the decency to perish with his sins, a reminder that God's punishments are written upon the flesh for all to read." Still she did not flinch, though something in her chest constricted painfully at the venom with which he spoke of himself, and when she answered, her voice was steady, almost gentle, carrying none of the pity he so clearly expected and would have despised. "I see a man standing in a library," she said quietly, holding a book of sonnets, with afternoon light in his hair, "and I confess I do not understand why that should require either apology or explanation." His reaction was not what she anticipated, not relief, not gratitude, but something far more complex that moved across his features like storm clouds gathering over the moors, anger and suspicion, and beneath them both, visible only for an instant before he shuttered it away, a fragile, terrible hope that he crushed as quickly as it surfaced, as if hope itself were a luxury he had long since forbidden himself to feel. That evening, when the house had settled into its customary twilight hush, and the Duke had retreated once more to whatever sanctuary he kept in the East Wing's forbidden depths, the Dowager Duchess summoned Elara to her private sitting-room, a space warmer and more intimate than the grand chambers of Ravenmoor, filled with faded photographs and embroidered cushions and the gentle tick of a porcelain clock that seemed to count out the seconds of a life lived largely in memory. "Sit with me, child," the old woman said, and there was something in her voice that told Elara this would not be their usual pleasant conversation about poetry or needlework or the latest novel from London, and when the Dowager poured 2 glasses of sherry with hands that trembled slightly, Elara understood that she was about to be trusted with something precious, something painful, something that had been locked away as carefully as the East Wing itself. "You have seen him now," the Dowager began, her rheumy eyes fixed on the fire that crackled in the grate, casting dancing shadows across her lined face. "Seen what remains of my nephew, and you did not flee. I watched you at dinner, watched the way you spoke to me without that particular quality of distraction that tells me a person is already planning their departure, and so I think perhaps you deserve to understand what has made him into this creature of shadows and silence." She paused, took a sip of sherry that seemed more fortification than pleasure, and when she spoke again, her voice had grown distant, as if she were reading from a book of sorrows she had memorized long ago. 3 years passed. When the autumn was turning to winter, my nephew was betrothed to Lady Catherine Blackwood, a girl of extraordinary beauty and gentle spirit, who had loved him since they were children together, who saw in him all the promise of a brilliant future, and who was, by all accounts, the light of his existence. The fire popped and settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney like fleeing souls, and the Dowager's voice grew heavier still. There was a house party at the Blackwood estate, a celebration of their coming union, and that night, that terrible night, a fire broke out in the East Wing where Catherine slept, flames that devoured wood and silk and flesh, with an appetite that seemed almost sentient in its cruelty. Elara's hands tightened on her sherry glass as the Dowager continued, painting in words a picture of horror of her nephew fighting through smoke and flame to reach his beloved, of the ceiling that collapsed just as his fingers brushed hers, of the inferno that took her life and left him scarred in body and soul, marked forever by the moment of his greatest failure. "He blames himself entirely," the Dowager whispered, "believes that if he had been faster, braver, less concerned with his own safety, he might have saved her, and so he has refused all society, all connection, even correspondence with those who once called him friend. He has become a man determined to make himself a ghost, to haunt these halls as penance for a sin he cannot forgive." She turned to Elara then, and in her ancient eyes burned something fierce and desperate. "He is not cruel by nature, child, but by construction he has built his coldness stone by stone, and I fear that soon there will be nothing left of the man he was, only the monument to his guilt." The rebellion began not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with the quiet placement of a single book outside a door that had never, in Elara's weeks at Ravenmoor, opened to anyone but shadows. A slim volume of Keats that she had found particularly moving, its pages soft with age, and marked in places by some long-ago reader who had underlined passages about beauty and truth and the strange immortality of sorrow, and she left it there on the cold stone floor of the corridor as one might leave an offering at a shrine, expecting nothing, hoping for something she could not quite name. And then she walked away without looking back, her heart beating with a peculiar mixture of audacity and tenderness that she did not fully understand. The book remained untouched for 3 days, and each morning Elara passed the Duke's study on some invented errand, fetching a shawl she did not need, searching for a letter she had not lost, and each morning she observed the volume lying exactly where she had placed it, gathering a fine layer of dust like a reproach, and she told herself that it did not matter, that she had expected nothing, that one could not force light into a room whose occupant had nailed shut every window, but still something in her chest ached, with a disappointment she refused to examine too closely. On the 4th morning, the book was gone, and Elara stood in the empty corridor for a long moment, her hand pressed against the wall as if to steady herself against the force of what that absence meant, not acceptance, perhaps not even acknowledgement, but at least curiosity, at least a hand reaching out from the darkness to grasp what had been offered, and she felt something bloom in her chest that was neither hope nor triumph, but something quieter, something that whispered that walls built stone by stone might also be dismantled stone by stone, if only one had patience enough to wait. After that, the offerings continued, a collection of Shelley left on Tuesday, Marcus Aurelius on Friday, a volume of Montaigne's essays that she had debated with herself for nearly an hour before deciding that perhaps a man drowning in his own guilt might benefit from philosophy that taught the acceptance of human imperfection, and each time the pattern repeated itself, the book lying untouched for days before vanishing in the night, like a secret between them that neither would acknowledge in daylight. a conversation conducted entirely in titles and authors, in the careful selection of words written by long-dead hands that might speak what neither of them dared to say aloud. She began to understand, in those quiet weeks of literary warfare, that the Duke's cruelty was not cruelty at all but architecture, that every harsh word and cold dismissal was a brick in a fortress he had built around himself, mortared with guilt and roofed with despair, and that to reach the man within would require not a siege but something gentler, something more subversive, the slow work of roots cracking stone, of water wearing away rock, of persistent small kindnesses that asked for nothing in return but offered, again and again, the radical suggestion that perhaps he deserved to receive them. The gardens of Ravenmoor had once been magnificent, this much Elara could discern from the bones of what remained. The skeletal hedgerows that spoke of careful geometric design, the stone pathways now cracked and heaved by frost and neglect, the empty pedestals where statuary had once stood, sentinel over beds of roses and lavender, and all the cultivated beauties that wealth and taste could command. But 3 years of abandonment had transformed this paradise into something wild and sorrowful, a green grief that sprawled in tangled abandon as if the very earth itself had been infected by the melancholy of the house it served, and it was here that Elara began to spend her afternoons, when her duties to the Dowager permitted, kneeling in soil that stained her serviceable grey dress, her fingers working to clear the choking weeds from around the few hardy plants that had survived their abandonment, finding in this simple labour a kind of peace that the shadowed corridors of the manor could not provide. She did not know, at first, that she was being observed, did not feel the weight of eyes upon her from the east wing window, where a figure stood half concealed by heavy drapery, watching as her small hands moved through earth and leaf and stubborn root, watching with an intensity that bordered on hunger as she coaxed order from chaos, life from death, beauty from ruin. And when she finally looked up to wipe the perspiration from her brow, the window was empty, the curtain falling back into place like a door closing on something that had almost been allowed to escape. But on the third afternoon of her gardening endeavours, as she knelt beside what had once been a magnificent rose bed and was now a thorny wilderness of unpruned canes and blackened deadwood, she became aware of a presence behind her, not the servants, who gave this part of the grounds a wide berth, not the dowager who could not have managed the uneven pathways, but something larger and darker that cast a shadow across her work, even as clouds obscured the pale autumn sun. And she turned to find the Duke standing not 10 feet away, his ravaged face unreadable, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that might have been aristocratic condescension, or might have been a man restraining himself from reaching toward something he desperately wanted, but believed himself forbidden to touch. "Playing at resurrection, Miss Ashworth?" His voice came, rough with disuse, and edged with that familiar mockery that she had come to recognize as armor, as deflection, as a blade turned outward to keep the world at bay. "I fear you waste your efforts. This garden died with everything else that was beautiful here, and no amount of feminine industry will convince it to live again." Yet even as he spoke these cutting words, his gaze remained fixed not on her face but on her hands, her soil-darkened, work-roughened hands that had just moments before been pressing seeds into earth with the tender confidence of one who believed in futures, in growth, in the stubborn persistence of living things. And she saw something flicker across his scarred features that his words could not quite contradict, something that looked almost like longing, almost like grief, almost like the desperate hope of a man who had forgotten how to hope watching someone perform an act of faith he could no longer imagine undertaking himself. "Perhaps," Elara replied, rising to face him with her chin lifted and her eyes steady, "or perhaps I simply believe that neglect is not the same as death, and that what has been abandoned may yet be reclaimed, given patience and care and someone willing to kneel in the dirt and do the difficult work of tending what others have given up on." The rain came without warning, as autumn rains so often do on the Yorkshire moors. One moment the sky merely threatened, heavy and grey as a bruise, and the next the heavens opened with a violence that seemed almost personal, sheets of water descending so thick and fast that Elara could barely see the manor house from where she had been working, in the far corner of the garden, and she ran without thinking toward the only shelter in sight, the old greenhouse that stood at the edge of the cultivated grounds like a forgotten cathedral of glass and iron. Its panes clouded with years of grime and neglect, its door hanging slightly askew on rusted hinges that screamed in protest as she pushed her way inside and stood gasping in the sudden dim quiet, water streaming from her hair and her dress and pooling on the cracked tile floor beneath her feet. The greenhouse had once been magnificent. She could see that even through the veil of abandonment, could trace in the empty beds and broken pots the ghost of what had flourished here, the exotic blooms and delicate ferns that required shelter from the harsh northern climate, the careful cultivation of beauty in a space designed to hold summer captive even as winter raged outside. And she moved deeper into the structure, almost reverently, her fingers trailing across the edge of a potting bench, still scattered with the desiccated remains of soil and seed, evidence of a gardener who had walked away mid-task and never returned. She did not hear him enter over the percussion of rain on glass, did not know she was no longer alone, until his voice came from the shadows near the door, rougher than usual, stripped of its customary mockery, saying simply, "My mother built this place. She had a passion for orchids, for things that should not survive in such a climate but somehow did, and she spent hours here, even in the coldest months, convinced that anything could flourish if only it was given proper shelter and sufficient care." Elara turned to find the Duke standing just inside the doorway. As rain-soaked as she was, his dark hair plastered to his scarred face, the marks of his burning somehow less terrible when wet, as if the water had softened not just his appearance but something in him as well, and for once he did not seem to be hiding, did not seem to be performing the role of monster he had so carefully constructed, but simply stood there like a man caught between the storm outside and some equally tempestuous weather within. "She sounds remarkable," Elara said softly, and he laughed, not the bitter sound she had come to expect, but something rawer, something that held within it the echo of genuine warmth long buried, and he moved further into the greenhouse, past her, to stand before a window so clouded with grime that the world beyond was nothing but grey shapes and falling water, and when he spoke again his voice was barely above a whisper, as if he were speaking not to her but to the ghosts that surely lingered in this place of growing things, gone to ruin. "She died when I was 12, and my father could not bear to come here after, could not bear anything that reminded him of her light, her laughter, the way she could make impossible things bloom, and I wonder sometimes if I inherited that weakness from him, this inability to exist in spaces that hold too many memories of what we have lost." The east wing corridor stretched before her like a throat of shadows, and Elara knew she should not be here, knew that this forbidden territory belonged to the Duke's private grief, and that her presence constituted a trespass more intimate than any physical boundary could convey. But the door had been left ajar, spilling a thin blade of grey afternoon light across the dusty floorboards like an invitation, or perhaps a trap, and her feet carried her forward before her better judgment could intervene, past the threshold and into a long gallery where the air hung thick with the particular stillness of rooms that have been sealed against time itself, and what she found there stopped her breath in her chest and held it captive, for the walls were lined with paintings, dozens of them, all shrouded in white cloths that had yellowed with age and neglect, transforming the space into something that resembled nothing so much as a mausoleum of memories, a graveyard of images that someone had deemed too painful to destroy but too agonizing to behold, and she moved among them like a ghost herself, her fingers trailing across the fabric coverings with a reverence that felt almost sacred, until she reached the largest canvas at the gallery's end and found that its shroud had slipped, had fallen away to reveal what lay beneath, and she stood transfixed before the portrait of a young man who could only be the Duke, as he had been before. The fire remade him in its cruel image, handsome beyond measure, his face unmarked and whole, both eyes clear and bright, with what could only be described as joy, his lips curved in a laugh that the painter had somehow captured mid-flight, and beside him stood a young woman of ethereal beauty, her hand resting on his arm with the easy intimacy of assured love, and Elara understood with sudden, devastating clarity that this was Lady Catherine, the betrothed who had perished, and that this portrait represented everything the Duke had lost, everything he had been, everything that fire and fate and his own guilt had stolen from him forever. "You should not be here." His voice came from behind her, and Elara spun to find him standing in the doorway, his scarred face cast half in shadow and half in the dim light that filtered through the shrouded windows, and the expression he wore was not the cold mockery she had come to expect, but something rawer, something that looked like a wound reopened, like watching someone read the most private pages of a diary never meant for other eyes, and she opened her mouth to apologize, to explain, to offer some defense for her intrusion, but he was already moving toward her, toward the portrait, his gaze fixed on his own vanished face, with a hatred so profound it seemed to consume the very air between them. "That man is dead," he said, and his voice was barely recognizable, stripped of all pretense and artifice, leaving only the naked pain beneath. He died in the fire, along with everything else worth saving. What remains is merely the husk, the ruin, the punishment that walks these halls because death would have been too merciful an escape. And Elara, who had learned in her weeks at Ravenmoor that silence was sometimes the cruelest response, and that the Duke's wounds required not the balm of platitudes, but the sharp medicine of truth, turned to face him fully and asked the question that had been forming in her heart since the greenhouse, since the garden, since that first night in the library when she had looked upon his scars and seen not horror but history, not monstrosity but mourning. "Then who stands before me now, your grace? If that man is truly dead, if nothing of him survives, then who is it that tends his aunt with hidden devotion, who reads the books I leave outside his door, who speaks of his mother's orchids with such tender grief, who watches me work in the garden with something that looks remarkably like hope?" The weeks that followed moved with the strange elasticity of time in places where the outside world has ceased to matter, where the rhythm of days is measured not by calendars or clocks, but by the quality of light through ancient windows, by the sound of footsteps in familiar corridors, by the accumulation of small moments that seem insignificant in isolation, but together form something approaching transformation. And Elara, who had arrived at Ravenmoor as a stranger seeking shelter, found herself woven into the fabric of the household so gradually that she could not have identified the precise moment when she ceased to be a guest and became something essential, something the house itself seemed to have been waiting for without knowing it. And the Duke, for all his protestations of solitude and his carefully constructed walls of coldness and distance, proved equally incapable of pinpointing when her presence had shifted from intrusion to necessity, when the sound of her voice reading to his aunt in the sitting room had become the melody against which he measured his own silence, when the sight of her crossing the grounds with her basket of garden tools had become the fixed point around which his restless pacing organized itself, and though he fought this awareness with all the considerable force of his will, though he retreated into longer silences and sharper words and more deliberate cruelties designed to drive her away, she remained steady as the moors themselves, patient as the seasons that turned around Ravenmoor's ancient stones. And it was this patience more than anything that undid him, this refusal to be frightened or discouraged or worn down by his determined monstrousness, until he found himself seeking her out in ways that horrified him, even as he could not seem to stop appearing in the doorway of his aunt's sitting room when the Dowager took ill with a winter chill, and Elara insisted on nursing her through the fever, bringing tea that no one had asked for, and lingering as she bathed his aunt's forehead with cool cloths, telling himself he was merely concerned for his relative, when in truth it was Elara's gentle competence that held him captive, her quiet voice murmuring reassurances, her hands that moved with such sure kindness. And later, when the Dowager slept and Elara sat exhausted by the fire, he had found himself sitting across from her and sharing a meal in silence that somehow felt more intimate than any conversation. And there was the evening when they argued about Byron in the library, she defending the poet's passion while he dismissed it as self-indulgent theatricality, their debate growing heated until he realized he was enjoying himself, actually enjoying the spark in her eyes and the flush on her cheeks, and the way she refused to yield to his superior tone, and he had withdrawn abruptly, frightened by his own animation. By the way, his scarred face had almost remembered how to smile. And there was the morning on the stairs, when her foot slipped on a worn step, and his hand shot out to steady her without thought, his fingers closing around her arm with a gentleness that surprised them both. And for a moment they had stood frozen in the grey light, her warmth seeping through the thin fabric of her sleeve into his palm, and he had felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he had believed impenetrable, showing its first irreparable fissure, and he had released her as though burned again, always burning, and fled to his study where he sat for hours staring at nothing, knowing with terrible certainty that Elara Ashworth had become the rhythm of his days, the pause between his heartbeats, the light toward which even his darkness could not help but turn. The village of Thornwick lay 3 miles distant from Ravenmoor's gates, a cluster of grey stone cottages and modest shops that huddled together against the moor's eternal winds as though seeking comfort in proximity, and Elara had ventured there at the Dowager's request to collect a particular medicinal tincture from the apothecary, grateful for the excuse to walk beneath the pale winter sun and feel something other than the manor's weighted atmosphere pressing against her skin. But she had not anticipated what awaited her among the villagers, had not prepared herself for the way conversation stuttered and died as she entered the apothecary's shop, for the sidelong glances exchanged between the women browsing the dry goods counter. For the particular quality of silence that descends when strangers discuss you in whispers they believe you cannot hear, and it was the apothecary's wife, a stout woman with a face that might have been kind under different circumstances, who finally spoke directly, her voice carrying the false sweetness of concern that barely concealed its poisonous curiosity. "You're the companion up at Ravenmoor, then the one staying with that poor dowager and her mad nephew," and Elara felt something cold settle in her chest at the word mad, at the casual cruelty of it, at the way the other women leaned closer, as though anticipating entertainment. And before she could form a measured response, the woman continued, warming to her subject with the enthusiasm of one who has long hoarded gossip and finally found a worthy audience. "They say he murdered her, you know, his betrothed, that the fire was no accident at all but his own doing, that he's cursed now, touched by the devil himself, that he prowls those halls like a beast, and that anyone fool enough to stay will meet the same end." And Elara, who had learned in her months at Ravenmoor to hold her tongue and choose her battles with care, found that her restraint had reached its absolute limit, that something fierce and protective had risen in her throat and would not be swallowed. And she turned to face the apothecary's wife with a coldness that would have done the Duke himself proud, her voice carrying clearly through the small shop. "You speak of a man you have never met, whose suffering you cannot fathom, whose character you know only through the distortions of idle speculation and malicious invention. The Duke of Ravenmoor is neither mad nor murderous, but merely wounded, merely human, and the cruelty with which this village has chosen to speak of his tragedy reveals far more about Thornwick's character than it does about his." And she collected her package and departed without waiting for response, her heart hammering against her ribs with the force of her own vehemence. But she did not anticipate that word would travel faster than her feet, that by the time she returned to Ravenmoor, the Duke would be waiting in the great hall with an expression she could not read, that he would demand in a voice stripped raw of all pretense, "Why did you defend me, I, who have given you nothing but coldness and cruelty, who have offered you every reason to despise me? Why would you speak for me, to strangers who mean nothing, whose opinions cannot touch me behind these walls?" And Elara, standing before him with mud on her hem and colour high in her cheeks, found that she could not fully answer, that the truth was too large and too terrifying to speak aloud, and so she offered only, because what they said was wrong, and watched something shatter behind his eyes, something that looked remarkably like the last defence of a man who had believed himself unworthy of being defended. It was the music that finally undid her, that reached past every careful guard she had constructed around her heart and found the tender places she had believed safely hidden, the music that came like a ghost through Ravenmoor's sleeping corridors in the deepest hours of the night, when the fires had burned to embers and the servants had long since retired to their quarters, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath in the darkness, and Elara, who had woken from troubled dreams she could not remember, had thought at first that she was still dreaming, that the haunting notes drifting through the stone walls were some phantom conjured by her restless mind. But as she rose and wrapped herself in her shawl and followed the sound through the labyrinthine passages, she knew with growing certainty that this was no spectre but something far more devastating, something alive and aching, and she found herself descending to the east wing, to a room she had glimpsed once through half-open doors but never entered, the music room where a grand piano sat shrouded in dust cloths during the day, where no one played, where no one had played in 3 years, according to the servants' whispered accounts, but someone played now. And as Elara pressed herself into the shadows of the doorway, scarcely breathing, she saw the Duke seated at the instrument with his back to her, his scarred profile visible in the guttering candlelight, his fingers moving across the keys with a fluency that spoke of years of devoted practice, of a gift that had not diminished despite his determination to let everything beautiful within him wither and die, and the music he played was unlike anything she had ever heard, a composition she did not recognize that seemed to pour directly from some wounded place within his soul, melodies that wove together sorrow and longing, and a desperate, devastating beauty, passages that built towards something like hope, only to collapse into grief, notes that hung in the air like tears, suspended before falling, and she watched his shoulders curve over the instrument, as though he were embracing it, or perhaps being consumed by it. Watched his hands, those hands that had steadied her on the stairs, that had brushed against hers when passing books, that she had imagined against her skin. In moments she refused to examine too closely, coax from the ivory keys every shade of pain. He refused to speak aloud, and she understood suddenly that this was his confession, his prayer. The one place where the man he had been before the fire still lived, where his capacity for feeling had not been entirely immolated but merely hidden, preserved for these secret hours when he believed no one could witness his vulnerability, and when the final notes faded into silence and his hands stilled upon the keys, she saw his shoulders begin to shake, saw him bow his head and press his fist against his mouth as though trying to contain something that could not be contained, and she realized he was weeping, this man who had shown her nothing but coldness and control, who had armored himself so completely against all human connection, was weeping alone in the darkness with no one to witness, no one to offer comfort, and Elara remained motionless in the shadows with tears streaming down her own face, knowing that to reveal herself would be a violation of something sacred, that this moment was not hers to intrude upon, but knowing also that something had shifted irrevocably within her heart, that she could no longer pretend her feelings for the Duke of Ravenmoor were anything so simple as sympathy or curiosity, or the satisfaction of a puzzle, slowly solved what she felt. Watching him break apart in the candlelight was love, terrible and complete and utterly impossible, and she retreated silently to her room with his music still echoing in her bones, understanding at last the full measure of her own undoing. The truth came to her, not in the bright honesty of daylight, but in the liminal hours between midnight and dawn, in the library where embers glowed like dying stars in the great hearth and shadows pooled in corners like spilled ink, and Elara had not expected to find him there when she descended in search of a book to quiet her restless thoughts, thoughts that had refused to settle since the night she had witnessed his weeping at the piano, since she had understood the full weight of what she felt for this broken, impossible man. But there he sat in the wing-back chair that had become his customary place during their increasingly frequent evening conversations, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, his gaze fixed upon the flames with an intensity that suggested he saw something far beyond the burning logs, something that existed only in the terrible landscape of memory. And when she moved to retreat, to leave him to his private torment, his voice stopped her. "Stay," he said, and the word was neither command nor request, but something raw, something that sounded almost like need. And so she stayed, settling into the chair across from him and waiting in the silence that stretched between them like a held breath, until finally he spoke again, his voice emerging hoarse and halting as though each word cost him something vital. "You have heard the stories, the servants' whispers, the village's condemnation. You know that Lady Marguerite died in the fire that marked me, but you do not know the whole of it, the truth that I have told no one, the reason these scars are not tragedy but justice." And Elara felt her heart constrict as he turned to face her fully, his ruined visage illuminated by firelight, his one good eye holding hers with desperate intensity, and he told her then of the night that had ended everything, how Marguerite had been visiting her family's estate when the fire broke out, how word had reached him at a dinner party in London, where he had been enjoying himself, enjoying the admiration of society, enjoying the privilege of his position and his unmarred face, how he had delayed his departure by 2 hours, 2 fatal hours, because he had been flirting with a baroness and drinking champagne and believing himself invincible, believing that tragedy was something that happened to other men, lesser men, and by the time he arrived at the burning manor, by the time he plunged into the inferno to find her, she was already gone, already consumed by flames that had stolen her breath while he had been laughing in a ballroom 50 miles distant, and he had refused to let the servants pull him from the blaze, had fought them as the ceiling collapsed, had wanted nothing more than to join her in that burning death, and the scars he bore were not punishment enough, could never be punishment enough, for the vanity and delay that had cost Marguerite her life. And as he finished speaking, his voice broke on her name, "She called for me," they said. "She called, and I was not there." And Elara, her own eyes bright with tears she did not try to hide, leaned forward and spoke with a gentleness that belied the steel beneath. "You have made yourself judge and executioner for a crime of being human, of being imperfect, of failing to know what you could not have known. The fire was not your doing, and your death, whether swift or slow, cannot purchase her life back from the grave." And she watched him flinch as though her words were physical blows, watched the terrible hope and terrible fear war across his damaged features, and she added softly, "You have sentenced yourself to a living death as penance. But tell me truly, is this what she would have wanted for you, this woman you loved? Would she have wished you to become a ghost, haunting your own existence?" The silence that followed her question hung between them like a living thing, fragile and trembling, and Elara watched the Duke's face as emotions moved across his scarred features like clouds across a storm-troubled sky, pain and longing, and something that looked almost like the first tentative stirrings of hope, dangerous hope, the kind that could shatter a man more completely than despair ever had. And when he finally spoke, his voice was rough, with the weight of words too long, unspoken, confessions that had festered in the darkness of his self-imposed exile. "I have spent 3 years perfecting the art of solitude, of convincing myself that I wanted nothing, needed nothing, that the walls I built were protection rather than prison, and then you came with your quiet courage, and your books left outside my door, and your hands coaxing life from dead gardens, and you have undone everything I believed about myself, everything I had resigned myself to becoming." And he rose from his chair with a movement that was almost violent, pacing before the dying fire like a caged creature, finally confronting the bars of its captivity. And Elara remained still, scarcely breathing, as he continued, "I find myself listening for your footsteps in the corridor, waiting for the sound of your voice with the Dowager, inventing reasons to encounter you in the library. When I had sworn to avoid all human contact, you have become necessary to me in ways I cannot explain and dare not examine too closely. You are the light that has crept beneath my barricaded door. And I am terrified." And he turned to face her then, his one good eye blazing with intensity while the other remained clouded and unseeing, a permanent reminder of all he had lost, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "I am terrified because I cannot ask you to bind yourself to a ruin of a man, to accept half a face and a heart so damaged I do not know if it still remembers how to love without destroying. I cannot offer you the life you deserve, the society and admiration and wholeness that should belong to someone of your grace and worth, and so I will not ask. I will not burden you with a choice that would condemn you to share my shadows." And Elara rose then, crossed the space between them, with steps that felt like the most courageous she had ever taken, and stood before him so close that she could see the fine tremor in his hands, the way his breath caught as though her nearness was both salvation and torment, and she spoke with a clarity that surprised even herself. "You speak of burdens and ruins, of half-faces and damaged hearts, as though I have not already seen all of you. I have watched you weep at your piano when you believed yourself alone. I have heard the music that lives within you despite everything you have done to silence it. I have witnessed your kindness to servants you pretend not to notice, and your devotion to an aunt you claim only tolerates. And I am telling you now, with all the certainty I possess, that I choose to stay not from pity, never from pity, but from something else entirely, something that feels like recognition, like coming home to a place I never knew I was searching for. And if you will not ask, then I will tell you freely. I see you clearly. Scars and shadows and all the broken pieces you believe make you unlovable, and I love you still. I love you because of them, not despite them." For a moment that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of ordinary time, the Duke stood frozen before her confession, his ravaged face a battlefield where hope and terror waged their silent war, and then something in him broke open, not shattered, but unfurled, like a door long sealed against the elements, finally yielding to persistent pressure, and he reached for her with hands that trembled, cupping her face with a tenderness so at odds with his fearsome reputation that Elara felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes, and when he kissed her it was nothing like the practiced seductions she had read about in novels, nothing smooth or confident or assured. It was desperate and tentative and devastating all at once, his lips finding hers with a reverence that spoke of thirst too long denied, of a man who had forgotten he was capable of gentleness and was now remembering in fragments. And she kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands finding the scarred plane of his cheek without hesitation, tracing the damaged flesh as though it were precious, and she felt the shudder that passed through his entire body at her touch, the way he leaned into her palm as though starving for contact. And for that perfect, suspended moment, everything else ceased to exist: the fire, the guilt, the years of isolation, the whispers and rumors and self-condemnation. There was only this, only them, only the impossible reality of connection after so long alone. But then, as suddenly as a summer storm breaking, he pulled away from her with a violence that left her stumbling, his expression transformed from wonder to something that looked horribly like panic, and his voice, when it emerged, was rough and ragged as torn cloth. "No, no, this cannot, I cannot." And he backed away from her as though she were the fire that had marked him, as though her touch burned more terribly than any flame. And before she could speak, before she could reach for him again, the walls she had spent months carefully dismantling slammed back into place, higher and more impenetrable than before. And he spoke with a cruelty that was clearly costing him everything. "You must leave Ravenmoor tonight, tomorrow. I care not, but you must go. Forget this place, forget this house. Forget me. I was a fool to allow myself to believe. Even for a moment, you deserve sunlight and society, and a man whose face does not make children weep. You deserve wholeness, and I have nothing whole left to offer." And Elara, reeling from the whiplash of tenderness to rejection, found her voice. "You cannot mean this after everything." But he cut her off with a gesture so sharp it was almost violent. "I mean every word, Mrs. Blackwood will arrange your passage. You will receive excellent references. You will find another position, a better one, in a house not haunted by ghosts. Go, Miss Ashworth, go and live the life I am incapable of giving you." And he turned his back to her, his shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining his composure, and Elara understood with devastating clarity that this cruelty was his final act of love, his attempt to save her from the darkness he believed himself to be. And though every fiber of her being screamed to fight, to stay, to force him to see what she saw, she recognized that this battle could not be won by siege. He had to choose to open his own door, and so, with tears streaming silently down her face, she whispered, "This is not farewell," with a conviction she clung to desperately, and fled the library before her resolve could crumble entirely, and the Duke remained standing before the dying fire, long after her footsteps faded, his hand pressed against the lips she had kissed. And if the servants heard sounds of anguish from behind the library's closed doors that night, they had long since learned not to speak of what they heard in the dark hours of Ravenmoor Hall. The dawn came grey and merciless, shrouded in mist that clung to the moors like a funeral veil, and Elara Ashworth descended the great staircase of Ravenmoor Hall with her single trunk carried by a footman whose eyes she could not meet, her own gaze fixed straight ahead as though looking back might turn her to salt, might shatter the fragile composure she had constructed through the longest night of her life, a night spent not in sleep but in the careful folding of garments, and the even more careful folding away of hopes she had not realized, she harbored until they were being torn from her grasp. And as the carriage door closed behind her with a sound of terrible finality, she did not permit herself to glance at the window, where she somehow knew he stood watching, a shadow among shadows, and the horses began their slow progress down the drive, while inside the house the Duke remained motionless at that window, long after the carriage disappeared into the mist, his forehead pressed against the cold glass, his breath fogging and clearing in a rhythm that felt like the only evidence he still lived. And when finally he turned from the window, it was to face a room that seemed to have grown impossibly vast in her absence, every corner echoing with memories. He had not meant to make her laughter. Over some passage of Byron, her quiet presence by the fire, the impossible softness of her lips against his, and he crossed to the sideboard, where decanters stood in gleaming rows, his hand reaching for the brandy with the desperate automaticity of a man seeking oblivion. But before his fingers could close around the crystal, a voice cut through the silence with the precision of a blade. "So, this is how you honor her memory, by destroying every chance at happiness that dares present itself." And the Dowager Duchess stood in the doorway, her small frame somehow filling the space with an authority that had nothing to do with physical presence, her eyes so like her nephew's had once been. Before the fire stole the light from one blazing with a fury that was indistinguishable from love, and she advanced into the room without waiting for invitation, her cane striking the floor with each step like a judge's gavel. "I have watched you entomb yourself in this house for 3 years. I have respected your grief because I understood it. I have allowed your isolation because I believed you needed time. But I will not stand silent while you send away the one person who has made you remember that you are still capable of living." And the Duke's hand fell away from the decanter, as though burned anew, his voice emerging hoarse and hollow. "You do not understand. I am protecting her. She deserves—" But the Dowager cut him off with a sound of pure contempt. "She deserves to make her own choices, as does any woman of sense and courage, and you have stolen that from her by deciding what she can bear without ever asking. Tell me, nephew, do you truly believe that Lady Catherine would have wanted this for you, this endless penance, this living death you have constructed in her name?" And the Duke flinched as though struck, the name of his dead betrothed, falling into the room like a stone into still water, and the Dowager pressed forward with the relentlessness of someone who understood that mercy sometimes wore the mask of cruelty. "I knew Catherine, I loved her, and I tell you now that she would weep to see what you have become in her memory. She would rage against this prison you have built from guilt. She would beg you to live, to love, to stop punishing yourself for a tragedy that was never yours alone to carry." And something in the Duke's expression began to crack, fissures spreading across the mask of control he had worn for so long, and when he finally spoke, his voice was that of a man confronting his own reflection for the first time in years. "What if I have forgotten how?" The carriage had travelled perhaps 2 miles from Ravenmoor Hall, 2 miles of rutted road that felt like 200, each turn of the wheels carrying Elara further from the only place that had ever felt like home, and she sat rigid against the worn velvet seat, with her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, her gaze fixed unseeing on the mist that swirled beyond the window, like the ghosts of all her abandoned hopes. When she heard it, distant at first, then growing closer with impossible speed, the thunder of hooves against packed earth, a single rider approaching with the desperation of a man racing against death itself, and her heart, which she had thought too bruised for further feeling, began to beat with such violence that she pressed her hand against her chest as though to contain it, and then the carriage lurched to a halt as the driver called out in alarm, and through the mist-shrouded window she saw him, the Duke of Ravenmoor, astride a black horse that steamed and stamped in the cold morning air, his face bare to the world without mask or shadow to shield him, the ruined half of his visage exposed to the grey light as it had never been outside the walls of his prison, and the sight of him there, unhidden, undefended, made her breath catch in her throat because she understood what it had cost him to ride out thus, to let the world see what he had spent 3 years concealing, and before the footman could move to open the door, the Duke had dismounted and crossed to the carriage himself, wrenching the door open with hands that shook, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other, she still seated, he standing in the mud of the road, with mist purling in his dark hair, and his breath coming harsh and ragged. And when he finally spoke, his voice cracked on the words like ice, giving way to spring. "I cannot promise to be whole. I may never be whole again. The fire took something from me that I do not know how to rebuild, but I can promise to try. Elara, if you will teach me how to live again." And she saw tears tracking down his face, cutting paths through the scarred and unscarred flesh alike, and he continued with the rawness of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. "I have been so afraid that loving you would betray her memory, afraid that allowing myself happiness would prove I never deserved forgiveness, afraid that you would one day look at me and see what I see, a monster, a ruin, a man who let the woman he was meant to protect burn while he stood helpless. But my aunt spoke truth this morning, truth I have been too much a coward to hear. Catherine would not have wanted this, and more than that, more than anything, I find I cannot let you go. I cannot return to that house and pretend you were never there. I cannot spend another 3 years or 30 as a ghost when you have shown me I might still be capable of being a man." And Elara, who had thought herself emptied of tears, found them flowing freely as she reached out and took his face in both her hands, the smooth skin and the scarred, the whole and the broken, and drew him toward her as she whispered, "Then come home with me, and we will learn together." Spring came to Ravenmoor Hall like a benediction, like forgiveness made manifest in blossom and birdsong, and the great house that had stood so long in shadow now opened itself to the light, as though awakening from an enchanted sleep. Curtains that had been drawn for 3 years were pulled back to reveal windows sparkling in the Yorkshire sunshine. Dust covers were removed from furniture that gleamed again with polish and care, and in every corner there were signs of renewal, of a household that had remembered how to breathe, and at the centre of this transformation stood the Duke and his Duchess, married now these 4 months, in a quiet ceremony, witnessed only by the Dowager and the household staff who had kept faith through all the dark years. And on this particular morning Elara sat in the garden she had once coaxed back to life, a book open in her lap, though her eyes were not upon its pages but rather upon her husband, who knelt in the soil beside her with his shirt-sleeves rolled to the elbow, his scarred hands working alongside hers to plant the roses. She had chosen varieties in cream and pink and deepest crimson, and she watched him as he worked, noting how the tension that had once held his shoulders rigid had softened over the months, how the lines of perpetual grief around his mouth had gentled into something that occasionally, wonderfully, curved into a smile, and as though sensing her observation, he looked up and caught her gaze. And there it was, that smile, crooked and still slightly uncertain, as though he was still learning the shape of it after so long without practice, and he reached out with one earth-stained hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, leaving a smudge of soil on her cheek that made him laugh, actually laugh, a sound that still struck her as miraculous each time she heard it. And from the terrace above them, the Dowager Duchess watched this scene with tears she did not bother to hide, her weathered face transformed by a joy she had long ago ceased to hope for, and she thought of how she had nearly lost him, not to the fire that had taken so much, but to the grief that had threatened to consume what remained, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever forces had sent this remarkable young woman to their door on that storm-racked autumn night. And below in the garden the Duke rose and extended his hand to help Elara to her feet, and as she stood he drew her close, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimacy that still felt new and precious, and he whispered against her lips, "I dreamed of you last night, not the old dreams, not fire and loss, but of this, of us, of years stretching forward instead of only backward." And Elara kissed him softly, tasting earth and sunshine and the salt of tears that might have been hers or his, and she replied, "Then we shall make those years worthy of the dreaming." And together they walked back toward the house that was no longer a prison but a home, their hands intertwined, their shadows stretching long and joined across the garden they had brought back to life. And overhead a bird sang from the eaves of Ravenmoor Hall, a small brown thing, ordinary and extraordinary, free, and yet choosing to stay. Dear listener, as we leave the Duke and his Duchess to their quiet happiness, to the gardens they tend together, and the music that now fills the halls of Ravenmoor with something other than grief, let us pause to consider what their story might teach us about the nature of wounds and the possibility of healing, for we all carry scars, do we not, though most of ours are hidden beneath the surface, where no eye can see them, etched into the chambers of our hearts by losses we could not prevent, by words we cannot unspeak, by moments when we failed to be who we wished to be. And perhaps you have built your own Ravenmoor, your own fortress of solitude, where you have convinced yourself that isolation is protection and that keeping others at a distance is kindness rather than fear. Perhaps you have told yourself that the fire that once burned you has left you too damaged to deserve connection, too broken to risk the vulnerability of being truly seen. And if this is so, if you recognize in the Duke's darkened corridors something of your own heart's architecture, then let this story be a gentle lantern in your shadows, illuminating not the path you must take, but simply the truth that paths exist, that doors which have been locked may yet be opened, that it is never, ever too late to step out of the darkness you have made your home for love. Dear listener, is not the absence of damage, it is not a reward given only to those who have emerged from life unscathed. Love is rather the extraordinary courage to say, "Here I am, in all my imperfection, with all my hidden wounds and visible failures," and to trust that this revelation will be met not with the rejection we fear, but with the recognition we crave. It is the miracle of finding someone who looks upon our scars, whether they mark our flesh or merely our spirits, and sees not evidence of our unworthiness, but testimony to our survival, not reasons to flee, but invitations to stay. And perhaps you are thinking that such love is the stuff of stories, that real life offers no Duchess to ride through the mist, no patient heart to leave books outside our bolted doors. But I would ask you to consider that love takes many forms, and that the person who might help you learn to live again may come disguised as a friend, a stranger, a moment of unexpected kindness, or even as the small, brave voice within yourself that whispers, against all evidence and experience, that you deserve more than the prison you have built. So I leave you with this wish, dear listener. May you find the courage to uncover the windows you have shrouded, to tend the gardens you have left to wither, to sit at a piano you have long neglected, and let your fingers remember what it means to create beauty from sorrow. May you discover that the warning you give to others, "Run, little bird, run," is the very invitation someone has been waiting to refuse, and when that someone stands before you, unafraid of your shadows, may you find in yourself the impossible bravery to let them rest well tonight, dear listener, and tomorrow, perhaps, leave a door unlocked, light a candle against the darkness, and trust that spring comes even to the most desolate moors, for it does, it always does, if only we can survive the winter long enough to see it.